All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. So we are here tonight for our second seminar, Found in Translation, which is a series of free humanities webinars organized in partnership with local institutions and funded by the Pennsylvania Council on Humanities and the NEA. My name is Vita Litvak. I'm the Director of Education at Fleisher Art Memorial, and I am going to kick us off tonight with a few introductions. Before we start, just a few Zoom tech reminders. I know we're all pros by now, but just to be sure, we are recording this webinar, so if you'd rather not be recorded, please keep your video camera off and send us messages in the chat. You can also opt to choose the display caption option with a button on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen. We will be in breakout rooms later tonight, and any questions that you have throughout the webinar, please drop them in the chat, and I will be monitoring tonight and reading those out to our presenters. I would also like to share our land acknowledgement and encourage you to share your own in the chat. We respectfully acknowledge that Fleisher Art Memorial is built on the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people. We openly recognize the Lenni Lenape tribe as the original inhabitants of the Eastern Pennsylvania, and the history of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that have brought ourselves and our institutions here. We respect and honor the continued presence of the Lenape people in their homeland and continue to seek greater understanding as we collectively live, work, and create. Tonight, we are very excited to present Electromagnetic Touch, Radios, and Community with the Sound Museum Collective from Philadelphia. We're also excited to be presenting this workshop in partnership with the Asian Arts Initiative. And with that, I want to introduce Anne Ishii, the Executive Director of the Asian Arts Initiative, who was instrumental in making this seminar come together. Anne, are you here? You want to take it over?
Thanks, Vita. I'd like to first and foremost thank Vita, of course, for putting this together, and Fleisher Art Memorial for being a fantastic presenting partner. I hope everybody online tonight comes to the 3 ensuing workshops that will be in person at the, Vita, you're gonna have to say the address in case people don't know where that is, but that'll be fun. So as she mentioned, I am the director of the Asian Arts Initiative. We're based in North Chinatown, where we serve community through the power of art. And I can't think of anything more to the service of the joy of the collective than a radio station, radio programming, radio as a concept and as a signal communication tool, whether that's private, public, open, pirated, licensed, whatever. It's just such a fascinating technology. And I think it speaks very directly in the format and the magic to the act of, well, I'm saying this because I'm a little bit older than some people, but especially with the younger generation of artists who work in collectives and cooperative spirit, I'm just so jazzed. Sound Museum Collective is not a person, and it isn't even a roster. It's a Sound Museum Collective. So I know today we have Elissa, Gladys, and Jackie, and I'm gonna let them introduce themselves individually, but they are the brain trust behind this amazing radio program, radio project. I keep calling it program, which isn't to indicate that it's a program, but a program like a project at Asian Arts Initiative. You're going to hear a lot more about that from us over the course of the next several weeks. So stay tuned for what will be an awesome interactive radio experience this summer at AI. In the meantime, we're at Fleisher, and I'm going to let the trio take over and maybe tell us what's going on. And maybe, did I forget anything? That's it, right? Okay, I got the housekeeping done. Thank you.
Cool, yeah. We're Sound Museum Collective. And the collective is as Anne said, it's not any one person, it's not even any one consistent group. It's like a constantly changing amorphous collective of people who are audio engineers and sound artists, mostly in Philadelphia, and mostly centering the voices of trans, non-binary, and women artists and engineers. Yeah, and we do a lot of workshops and skill shares and stuff. And if you want to be part of the collective, you already are.
You're in.
Yeah, just talk to us. I guess individually, I'm Jackie. I use they, them. Yeah, and I work primarily as a recording engineer and mixing engineer for music and bands. And I also make music and am a sound artist on my own accord.
My name is Elissa. I use she, her pronouns. I am, well, I guess pre-COVID was a lot of sound engineer. Slowly have been getting back into that as our cultural landscape is shifting. Once again, I'm also a radio engineer at the Scribe Video Center for WPEB. And yeah, I'm also a musician and sound artist.
Hey, my name is Gladys Nobriga. I go by she, her, they, them, and I DIY sound engineer, sound artist, experimental kind of noise musician, and I've worked with a lot of the community radio stations around town. I was their volunteer coordinator at one point, and just get into a lot of different projects around, really interested in how sounds form around us.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah.
We have a pretty
started.
cool presentation for you tonight. We're going together tackle the technology of radio. We're going to cover like policy and history of radio. And then we're going to work together to kind of reimagine what radio could be. I think a lot of people argue that radio is like an arcane technology, and we disagree. We think that there's just been policies put into place that has like rendered it to what it is today, and it doesn't have to be that way. So we're interested in having generative conversations with all of you about that.
And before we dig in, we're kind of going to be doing this in 3 separate parts, each about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a brief break in between each section. So if you have questions that are coming up as we go through, please put them in the chat, and we'll have a moment to break, answer questions, and also if you need just a Zoom break at that time, you're welcome to take that.
Yeah, 2 hours is a long time, so we just want to acknowledge that.
It can be pretty heavy content as well. So we're going to get started with the electromagnetic spectrum, taking it back a little bit. We'll take it back a little bit here, and we see all the way on the left-hand side, we start with radio waves. And these waves come to us through radiation from the sun. So there's constantly waves around us at all times. The frequency, which we'll talk a lot about too, is how often, basically how many waves per second. And radio waves over here on the left-hand side are the longest. They are the size of a football field. And this is really important later on when we will talk about how FM and AM radio collaborate. There's also, they are the longest waves. And then you have microwaves over here. And I think this is really important to sort of ground ourselves in how these are changed so that we hear sound from them. Microwaves have a higher frequency, which means they're more consistent. And then we have infrared light. This is anything like sun, fire, something we can't see, but we do feel it as heat. And that's going to lead us into our visible light, which is a very, very small portion that we see. The longer waves are the red. And as we move through the spectrum, violet, which is the last color we can see, is the shortest wavelength. Then you have ultraviolet, which is what causes our sunburns. Again, we feel it even more intensely than infrared. X-rays, which can pass through soft tissues, it's used in the medical field. And then you have gamma rays, which are much smaller, like the size of a nucleus. So this spectrum is going to be really helpful as we move on into this next slide, which is the different uses in radio. So one-way radio communications when you have one transmitter and multiple receivers. So AM radio, it's in your cars, it's in any other radios, you can't talk back into it, you can just hear what comes through it. So you see here the AM radio is amplitude modulated. Amplitude is the height of a wave. And you see here, the waves are constantly happening all around us. And so what is added on is a carrier wave that changes the amplitude. And that then is what you hear on the radio as the height changes. And so this you can hear it through longer distances because it can bounce off even into our atmosphere and bounce back to us. So AM radio can be heard way longer distances and is kind of similar to ham radio, which is two-way radio. We'll get into later. Frequency modulated sounds a lot better because instead of monitoring the height of a wave, you're changing the frequency, which is how often a carrier wave is modulated and sent out into your radio. And you see those two at the very top right of this slide here. Two-way radios are the next way that we can communicate, and that is transmitting and receiving. So each of these have both a transmitter and a receiver inside, and that we'll get into detail later. You see here on the bottom, AM radio's wavelength is a lot longer. Then you have CB radio. CB radio is something that mostly truckers use, but then there's also channel 9, for example. There are 40 channels that are used on a take-turn basis, and truckers, like I said, truckers use it on channel 19 primarily. Channel 9 is for emergencies, but anyone else with a citizens band radio can talk to each other through short distances. Ham radio is one that requires a license. So CB doesn't require a license. Like it says in the name, it's a citizens band. People can use it, but not necessarily like walkie-talkies. So a ham radio sends out frequencies that are much larger. And so you can talk to anyone around the world if you have this one. And it's actually what most people use it for. And it's really easy to make. So a lot of people have them. Walkie-talkie is another way to have two-way radio communication. There's two different kinds. There's general mobile radio service, which is used a lot more with people like police or emergencies. Hospitals will use some of these too, and it is also licensed, as opposed to the family radio service, which is not licensed. And that's the one that you use to talk to someone who's about 1 to 10 miles away. And they share channels as well. So CB radio has channels, walkie-talkies has channels, ham does not have any channels. And then we have our wireless communication, which you see is all the way over here on the right side of the frequency band. So the frequencies are much closer together and they're a lot easier to hear. And that's similar to the internet, which we'll talk a little bit about later, because it's more of like algorithmic, sending data through ones and zeros rather than using the actual waves that are around us. And then you have Bluetooth, and Bluetooth works really well because it has something called adaptive frequency hopping. So it doesn't interfere, and it's why you can connect on such short distances really well. It keeps hopping around these frequencies. And now we'll get a little more into the tech side.
Hey, okay. So now that Gladys has given us a pretty concise overview of the ways of different kinds of radios and the electromagnetic spectrum, let's really get into how radios work. So radios exist on several different broadbands, and these are ranges of frequencies that radios are tuned into. The broadband depends on the electrical output modulating a signal and how the antenna is tuned. What does that mean? So for example, FM radio, our bandwidth for that is 88 to 108 megahertz, right? Because we're talking about the electrical modulation. So for example, if you're tuned into 88.1, which is WPB, West Affiliate Educational Broadcast, you're tuning into 88.1 megahertz. Same if you're tuning into like WKDU, it's 91.7 megahertz. Where AM radio, on the other hand, the bandwidth for that is 550 to 1720 kilohertz. So frequency controls band and channel. Radio waves are produced artificially by time-varying electric currents, modulation, consisting of electrons flowing back and forth in a specially shaped metal conductor, which you guessed it, that's our antenna. So there's an oscillation created by a radio transmitter, and that's what's determining the frequency of the radio waves. That's the number of megahertz or kilohertz. So we're using, in short, electricity to encode a carrier wave, which Gladys touched upon. We're going to go into a little bit more. It's called a carrier wave because it's carrying data. And this encoding happens because you're oscillating the wave at a particular frequency and then sending it to an antenna that is tuned to that frequency. So in short, you're taking a pure, crisp, perfect sine wave and you're modulating it so it can carry information. So if we produce a radio wave just from the audio signal alone, it would contain a wide range of wavelengths, each traveling in different ways, and they could get broken up on their journey. So we're going to add our required signal to a known wavelength called the carrier signal. And this signal is piggybacking, like our audio signal is piggybacking on the carrier wave. And once it reaches its destination, it's going to be separated. So we'll separate the carrier wave and the audio signal. So we just have that audio signal again. And the carrier wave is going to be of a higher frequency than the highest frequency found in the signal. So let's look at this. Gladys did touch upon this, but let's get a little bit more into what's going on here. So a carrier wave is a pure wave of constant frequency. That's what we see right here. This is our carrier wave. Very perfect, very consistent. And we're using this to carry our data, which in this case, it's going to be our audio signal. So we need to impose another wave on top of this carrier wave, and we're going to call this our input signal. So the process of imposing an input signal on top of a carrier wave is called modulation. So when we're talking about modulation, modulation is the process of changing the shape of the carrier wave to somehow encode the information that we want to transmit. So let's quickly just talk about some basic wave properties. We have amplitude, which that refers to the height of the wave. And then we have frequency. And frequency is the number of waves per unit of time. And then we also have phase, which is the constant that tells us the value of the sine function, which I don't really understand. We're not going to talk about it anyway. So you can create an input signal whose height varies with the loudness of your voice and add that to the carrier. And then the carrier wave's amplitude will change corresponding to the input signal fed into it. And that's what we refer to when we're talking about amplitude modulation or AM radio. That's what's happening. So see, we're combining these, and then we got this modulated result. So this is our encoded signal that we're going to send through our antenna. And then over here, we can do the same thing, but using frequency instead, like Gladys said. So you can create, so if we add this signal to the carrier wave, we change the frequency of that wave. And yeah, we're doing essentially the same thing. We're modulating our carrier wave, but we're using frequency instead. So why aren't we just sending our audio signal out directly? I touched upon this a little bit, but you know, it has all the information we need. Why aren't we doing that? Well, in order to do that, it would have to travel in very low frequencies, like electromagnetic frequency waves. And the problem with that is, in order to transmit that, we're going to have to need a lot of power and a huge antenna. So in short, it's just cheaper and more convenient to use low power to carry as much information as possible. So both AM and FM, the higher the frequency of the carrier wave, the more information can be carried. And then just to put this more into perspective for you, the carrier wave, that is what your radio is tuned into. So when you're tuning into 88.1, that's your carrier wave that you're tuning into. And then once again, we measure AM radio in kilohertz and FM radio in megahertz. Please type all your questions in the chat if you have any. Why can't I get this side to change? Here we go. All right, so let's back it up. So we learned from Gladys, radios have the longest wavelengths on the electromagnetic spectrum. This is just our recap. Radio waves are generated by charged particles undergoing acceleration, such as time-varying electric currents. That's our oscillation, right? We're encoding our signal. We're doing this artificially with something called a radio transmitter. The transmitter is what modulates our audio signal, and then we're going to send it through an antenna by producing electromagnetic waves. And the antenna is what projects the waves through space. And that antenna is tuned very specifically to the frequency it's transmitting. So what you're doing is you're adjusting the height of the antenna to make sure, that's how you tune it, is you're adjusting the height. And it's the process of matching the antenna impedance with the source impedance. And you use something called an SWR meter to do that. That's standing wave ratio meter, which is measuring the standing wave ratio in a transmission line. So essentially the meter indirectly measures the degree of mismatch between the transmission line and its load. So we're tuning our antenna. On the other end of that, and this is also with the one-way radio, you have a receiver. So say you're in your car, or you have your clock radio or whatever, that also has an antenna attached to it. It's not tuned in the same way that our transmitter antenna is tuned. So that antenna is what's going to pick up the electromagnetic waves that have been shot through space, and it's going to catch these waves, and then it's going to decode inside our receiver. We got to, like I said before, we got to separate the carrier wave from the from our audio signal. So we're going to decode that. We're going to demodulate that. And then we're going to have our audio signal, and it's going to be awesome because then we're listening to radio. So it's important to note that different radio frequencies behave differently, right? We saw all the different kinds of waves on the spectrum before. Long waves can diffract around obstacles like mountains and follow the contour of the earth, and we call those ground waves, where shorter waves can reflect off the ionosphere and return to earth. We call those sky waves, where much shorter wavelengths bend or diffract very little and travel on a line of sight. So their propagation distances are limited to the visual horizon, like sight line. And we're about to talk about radio interference a little bit more, but this is where I want to pause a little bit. It's really important to note with radio interference that this is why we have so much of the policies that we have right now around radio. And the political landscape that is shaped around radio very much has to do with radio interference. Like Gladys was saying in the beginning, there's so many different kinds of radio waves all around us all the time. It's very cool that this is all happening, and we like sometimes aren't even privy to it. But things like broadband is a form of, or like Bluetooth. There's just all these different kinds of waves, and they're engaging with each other along with the environment. And once again, because of radio interference, that is why we have so many laws that strictly regulate the ways in which radio can be used. So yeah, when Jackie goes into the history and policy and whatnot, we're gonna that's where we're gonna get better understanding. But I did really want to pause because before we talk about the different ways in which radio interference can happen, I really wanted to make note of that. I know this is a crazy slide. So, okay, when we're talking about interference, we're talking about our radio waves becoming distorted, right? And that I imagine that perhaps when you hear radio interference, you can actually something comes to mind, most likely, even if you don't exactly know what's happening. But you can probably hear in your head an idea of what radio interference is. Like whether it's like radio stations bleeding into each other, or it's like crackling, or like you're just like not getting something. That distorted sound is radio interference. So I guess I'll start with EMI, which is electromagnetic interference. That happens mostly from things like lightning or like high voltage power lines. And it's because of the very, very large electrical output that they're putting out, and that can affect radio waves and distort them. But I want to talk a little bit more. Also, RF, I don't think I said that. That stands for radio frequency. So when we're talking about RF interference, gotta change my notes. Okay. So waves are the displacement of matter that carries energy, which means that waves can overlap, right? And when the waves are overlapping, we call this superposition. And sometimes this is constructive, like everything we talked about before with like AM and FM. But also sometimes it can be really destructive. And that leads to interference. So waves overlapping can cause an interference pattern. Pretty much they're combining to create an entirely new pattern. So imagine water ripples, right? Imagine two water ripples hitting each other and the shape that they create, right? It's a whole new ripple. That's what's happening. An example of that, like an audible signal or indicator of that, is think about like when one station is bleeding into another station. And I just want to show you a visual. If we look over here on the left hand, well, first of all, this is just an example of radio interference. I thought it was a cool picture, right? But if we look over here, this is like a destructive form of superposition, right? So we have this one wave and it's combining with our second wave. And instead of making something cool, like we see over here in this corner where this mass is, like this is sick, right? This is what we were talking about before. No, instead we've got this gobbledygook. It's like a totally dilapidated wave and it's nothing. It sounds bad. And what's the point? So that's one form of interference or like wave distortion. Another thing, also you probably know more about this than I do, but when we're talking about waves can become out of phase. So let's look at this little picture right here. So when waves are in phase, we'll see right here, this trough is like perfectly in line with this trough. And this crest is perfectly aligned with this crest. And then we have this beautiful wave right here, incredible. But when waves are out of phase, you'll see this trough is aligned with the crest and the crest is aligned with the trough. And what ends up happening is they just cancel with each other out and then you have no wave. So waves are coming out of phase. That's another form of interference. Another one is reflection. So, oh, you can't see it, but there's a radio tower right here. So you have your signal and it's hitting, pretty much when our radio signal is hitting a much larger object. And if that object in particular is very smooth, what ends up happening is it hits our building in this case. And at the same exact angle at which it hits the building, it bounces back at that same angle, but inverted. So that inversion, or like because it's inverted, that's another form of distortion. And I'm trying to go quick, but the last one I want to talk about is this one down here. This is diffraction. And pretty much what happens is a wave becomes distorted because it needs to bend to get through a certain space. So we see our waves right here. In order to get through this tiny little thing right here, they got to bend. And this is like another form of interference. Okay, I'm gonna try and zip through this. Let's talk about some of the the electrical components that we'll find within a transmitter. So we have a capacitor that stores electrical energy. We have our inductor, which is this little metal coil that stores energy in a magnetic field. So pick that up. And then we have a transistor, which amplifies our electrical power, right? We're making it bigger. That's what the transistor is doing. So we already talked about the oscillator. Let's go through the signal path. First, our signal is going to hit the oscillator. That's what encodes the data, our audio signal, onto sine waves, right? And then these sine waves are sent out across the air via the antenna on carrier waves, right? That's what the oscillator is doing. That's what we were talking about before. From the oscillator, we're going to hit something called the PLL, which is the phase lock loop. And this exists to keep frequencies from drifting when specifically the inductor heats up over time. So if the frequency of the oscillation is changing due to the inductor heating up, then the listeners on the receiving end would have to be constantly changing the dial to try and listen to the same broadcast. So it's just the frequencies are shifting because the inductor is getting hot, which is why the phase lock loop exists. So from the oscillator, we're going to go to the phase lock loop. We're going to go back to the oscillator, and then we're going to hit the gain stages. And this is where we get our power from. We're going to add power so we can shoot it through the antenna. And I don't know, just a fun fact, our signal doubles with every 3 decibels. Okay, this is just a picture I wanted to show you. I'm not gonna step through it because we kind of talked about it. I'll just say that this is like our antenna signal. But what I do want to plug is this is from a really sick book called How Radio Signals Work. All the Basics plus Where to Find Out More by Jim Sinclair. And I really, really like this text because I think it takes some really like heady info and makes it pretty accessible. So I'll type that into the chat later, but it's called How Radio Signals Work, All the Basics plus Where to Find Out More by Jim Sinclair. And yeah, this is what I was talking about. Okay, so the transmitter isn't the only part of our transmitting technology. There's some other things besides the transmitter itself that are important to getting a really good signal out there. And the first one we're going to talk about is a limiter. So a limiter is a tool for signal processing, like mixing music is an example of signal processing. And it applies a type of dynamic range compression. So what that means is it takes an input signal, evaluates its amplitude, which is the volume, and lowers the peak of the waveform. So if those peaks reach and exceed whatever we set our threshold at. What does that mean? In short, we're using the limiter to make sure that we are not over-modulating our signal, because if we over-modulate our signal, it's going to be weird and distorted. So we're using the limiter to make sure that over-modulation doesn't happen. And then another thing that we can put in our transmission line is a low-pass filter. And we're going to add this because transmitters often generate harmonics, which are multiples of a frequency. Harmonics, like when you think about people harmonizing, or harmonics are what give a specific instrument its specific sound. So we're going to use pretty much what the low pass filter is doing is we're creating a gate of sorts, right? We're using this filter and we're saying all of the low frequencies can pass through, but these high frequencies cannot. And that's where we're going to reduce distortion by allowing lower frequencies to pass through, but not allowing the higher frequencies to pass through. So limiter, low pass filter. And then I drew kind of this very crude picture. Okay, so here we have our mixer, or like in a radio station, it's a board, right? So you're definitely doing this from a radio station, big board, whatever. You have your mixer and your microphone. From your mixer, right? This is our input signal. We're talking about our audio signal. Maybe your laptop's plugged in. Maybe it's a CD player. Maybe it's a record player. Whatever your audio signal is, it's going into the limiter, right? And this is how we're preventing overmodulation. We're going to send our signal then in mono, right? We're only going to broadcast in mono because it's just going to sound better. through the transmitter, right? This is our transmitter. After our transmitter, this is I draw it, but this is where we would have the low pass filter to cut out some of those harmonics. And then we're going to send it through a coaxial cable, or coax cable as it's as it's commonly known. So, right, we're sending our signal through the coax and into our antenna, which once again has been tuned. We've tuned our antenna, we've adjusted the height, so it's tuned to the very specific frequency, right, that we're trying to transmit on. And then our waves are being shot out over space like this. And then we have our antenna attached to a mast, right? And that's because we want our antenna to be as tall as possible, because we want our waves to go above everything, so they're not just like bouncing off of buildings. It's just going to help us in the long run with interference. So we have our mast that we have our antenna attached to, so it can be as tall as possible. Y'all with me? I put this face here because this is like where I feel at this point. Okay, so this symbol right here we talked about is the antenna. Before we like break this down a little bit more, I want to kind of in short explain what's happening on the receiving end. So you have our receiving antenna, right? It's picking up our signal, and we have a dial on our receiver that's saying, this is the frequency that I want to listen to. So we're tuned in so we can only hear one frequency. That's how we hear one radio broadcast at a time. And then we're going to demodulate, right? We're taking the carrier signal and we're separating it from the audio signal. We needed to encode it so it could travel, but now we're going to decode it. And then we're going to add power, and then we're going to listen to it through the speaker. Yeah. So let's talk about real quick what's happening on here. So the RF filter is bandpass filter, and this is used to eliminate any noise from the input signal. And this is the power. We're going to add power to our signal using the RF amplifier right here. The mixer, this is the part that's essentially allowing us to tune into a very specific frequency. So the mixer is a nonlinear electrical circuit that creates new frequencies from the two signals applied to it. So the two signals are being applied. So we have a signal coming from the RF filter. And then we also, it's not on here, but we have a signal coming from the demodulator that's going through the local oscillator and into the mixer. So we have a signal coming from here. We have a signal coming from here. These frequencies are like added and subtracted, and then they're going to go over here to the IF amplifier and filter. And essentially, these are just like fixed frequency amplifiers, which will reject any unwanted signals, right? So it's like the combination of this right here is helping us like tune into where we want to be. And then we're going to go to the demodulator, which is a crystal, it's a crystal diode. And I'd love to emphasize that because I think it really just speaks to the magic of radio. We have these giant 10-foot invisible waves traveling through space, carrying all like emotion, music, news. And then we use a crystal so we can hear it. Sick, honestly. So we have a crystal diode right here that's going to help us. It's the demodulator, it's an electrical circuit. And this is, like I said, where we're going to take the carrier wave and separate it from our audio signal. And then we're going to have power. And then we're going to send it through the speaker. Okay, in short. So receivers are tuned to receive a single frequency. This is how you listen to only one radio station at a time. And the one with the particular frequency of the carrier wave, right? We talked about that. The numbers on the dial are telling you the frequency of the carrier wave you're listening to. And then a crystal diode will demodulate the carrier wave. And then you get to hear what's on the radio. Pretty sick. So, and this is all to say, I was talking about this as a transmitter and receiver as two different components. But like Gladys told us in the beginning, two-way radios have both of these technologies in one. So a walkie-talkie or ham radio is going to have both like transmitting technology and receiver technology within it. This is like the tech session. So this is where we're about to hit a 5-minute break. I'm going to take a moment.
I would like to add one thing is that
when you change station and you're like, oh, I'm going from 88.1 to 105.3, that is based on the turns of the wire. So there's a wire inside of each receiver, and based on how many turns there are in them, that allows you to tune into that particular frequency.
Do you have anything you want to add? So this is our 5-minute break during this time. So we'll come back at 7:20, but if you want to sit around, this is when I'm going to start answering some questions. I'm just going through the chat right now. K8, in practice, how is the antenna grounded in an urban environment for electrical safety? I'm not exactly positive because I don't think you're necessarily going to be electrocuted by touching a transmitting antenna. You could be, but
Yeah.
maybe.
I think it's pretty unsafe. I think it is pretty unsafe to touch an antenna that's sending signal. It's not safe. I mean, it's like your electronics are grounded the same way that any small electronics are grounded in your house, but the antenna itself, I don't know what processes, if any, it goes through to like make that safer, but I do think it is pretty unsafe to touch a transmitting antenna.
I also think that I don't know if you have to ground an antenna, because I think the idea of grounding is that you're sending out. I think because you tune the antenna, I don't know if you would need to ground. I'm also kind of making this up. This is just like what I know about electronics, which is like a ground exists because we're trying to like send literally excess electricity to the ground, where like we've tuned the antenna in such a specific way that we're sending out exactly what we want to. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer. But Jenny asked us a question about police scanners. And one thing I will say about police radio is when we were talking about encryption before, police radios are encrypted in a very, very specific way that you need like very specific devices in order to like demodulate that, like we were saying before. And that's like why it's pretty difficult to just like tune into police radio. It's because you need like special equipment to do that. That was just the address. Does anyone have any other questions, or do you want to add anything?
No, but that's just kind of what the FCC does, is they have made a particular type of gear that you need, like a particular transmitter or receiver that you would need to be able to hear those frequencies. But there isn't a reason why probably couldn't tune in by messing around with a GMRS and listen to police radio. I mean, let's imagine that later on.
So I think, let's just take a moment. Well, we said 7:20. Let's just take maybe, if anyone has any other questions. Oh, I think the antenna is connected to the grounding circuit of whatever building it's on.
Sounds smart.
Yeah, that seems fine.
Also, probably everybody saw, but I did send a link of some resource links that we put together for this presentation. So some of it are things that we'll be directly referencing, but some of it is also just like fun ways you can find out more about radio and more about local community stations. So I highly recommend opening up that link and checking it out. I'm going to be referencing a couple things on when I jump into presenting next up, so it might be helpful to have it open.
Anyway, I'm gonna turn off the camera for a sec, right?
Sure, for 2 to 3 minutes, and we'll be right back.
All
We'll
right.
be right back after this important announcement from us.
Awesome. I am just gonna, do you want me to play some music while we wait, or just should we wait and should we rest in silence?
You can play music, whatever you feel.
Okay.
Hey, we're back. All right, we're gonna hop back in here. Share the screen. This one, great. All right, so I am gonna get into some history and policy of radio in the U.S. And we're kind of gonna go through since radio's since it began being regulated up until the almost current day, and then Gladys is kind of going to take over for us. But I'm going to be hopping back and forth between the government regulations that have happened and then the cool pirate radio and resistance movements within radio that have happened through time. So the very, very first thing that the US government did to regulate radio was the Radio Act of 1912. And this basically was law passed that said you have to have a license to be on air. And that was largely due to the fact that there's just a limited amount of frequency bands that we can broadcast on. So that was their first attempt of trying to pare down on how many people were going to be using the radio waves altogether. And I found out recently that this was also this whole law was partly enacted because of the Titanic sinking, because another big part of this act was saying that boats and ship captains had to be connected into radio at all times. So this was part of people's interest in the usefulness of radio. In 1929, this is when the government started deciding more about what they thought should be on the radio. And they passed this thing called the Fairness Doctrine, which was partly, again, them being if there's only a very limited amount of radio signals that people can be on, we want to make sure that the content is good and that people have certain obligations that they need to abide by. So one of the things that they said, a few of the main things they said was you need to cover a broad range of views on any particular topic or subject. So if you are representing one viewpoint, you have to represent an opposing viewpoint. And you also need to refrain from expressing your own personal views too much. That was one big thing. And then another big part of it was saying that you had to cover and be attentive to controversial issues that were happening. That was sort of within your civic duty to do so. And also that you needed to be accountable to the community and represent the viewpoints of your listeners. So those were some big things that they talked about in the Fairness Doctrine. And then in 1934, the FCC, it was the Communications Act really created the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Is that right? Yeah. Oh yeah, it's on fire. Yeah, so that was officially created in 1934 as the overviewing entity that was going to start overseeing not just radio, but all broadcast technologies. So television, telephones, telegrams, the way you could wire messages, all of that was being covered by the FCC as an entity. And then in 1946, the public service responsibility was kind of them digging deeper into the Fairness Doctrine and really going into detail about how people were going to be accountable to their communities and how they were going to represent a fair breadth of opinions. There's some sort of interesting language in some of the regulations that were in the public service responsibility. And I'm just going to read a few things that they did, which was they specified some types of programming material and practices that were not deemed to be in the public interest, including defamation, racial or religious intolerance, obscenity, and excessive playing of recorded music to fill airtime.
And then they encouraged stations to program things of local interest that stimulated public discussion, noting the importance of news. They outlined these 14 major elements of programming that are generally necessary in the service of public interest. And these were: 1, opportunity for local self-expression; 2, the development and use of local talent; 3, programs for children; 4, religious programs; 5, educational programs; 6, public affairs programs; 7, editorializations by licensees; 8, political broadcasts; 9, agricultural programs; 10, news programs; 11, weather and market reports; 12, sports programs; 13, service to minority groups; and 14, entertainment programs. So that's kind of a sick list, I think, aside from the sports programs, which I'm like, why is a lot of music not in public interest, but sports programs are? That one's a little sus to me, but it's interesting because I think a lot of the things outlined, whether or not they were implemented in the ways that we hope they were pretty cool ideas. So now I'm going to jump into some of the resistance movements and pirate radio movements that were happening a little later on as radio started to become a lot more widespread. The first known instance of pirate radio being used in a sort of revolutionary way was in Bologna, Italy, by a bunch of kind of countercultural youth activists who made this station Radio Alice. They were using an ex-military transmitter that they got a hold of, and Franco Bifo Berardi, who was one of the founders of the station, described Radio Alice as a mix between a classical medium of militant information and a sort of art experiment in media sabotage. Radio Alice was closed down by the Italian police in 1977. I know, big boo, but they did a really cool thing, which is that they remained on air the whole time they were being raided by the police, and basically made it a public statement of being like, this is what's happening currently. They actually reopened again 2 years later, but were shut down again. And yeah, they covered a bunch of different subjects: labor protests, poetry, yoga lessons, political analysis, love declarations, cooking recipes, I know, good stuff, and various music. Then the first well-known instance of pirate radio in the US was Black Liberation Radio in 1986, which was this awesome effort by this person, Mbana Kintako, in Springfield, Illinois. And he was a legally blind African-American man in his mid-30s. And he began making this station because he felt that the radio and the media in Springfield, Illinois was not accurately representing the Black and African-American community that he was a part of. And so he just kind of took matters into his own hands and started this really awesome micro radio station that was very small. I think it was just like a couple watts, maybe even a 1 watt station. And it served just a few miles of people. They think like about 1,000 people that were just in his local housing community. But he was doing it 24/7 for a lot of the broadcast time, and just having people from the community come in and jump on the radio. It was very cool, and it actually inspired a ton of following micro broadcasting movements. One of the more notable ones that happened, which was directly inspired by Black Liberation Radio, was Free Radio Berkeley in 1993, which sprung up in the Bay Area. And this was mainly hosted by this guy, Stephen Dunifer. And it started just broadcasting a little bit here and there, and eventually began broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 104.1 FM. And they were using 50 watts of power, which is kind of a big deal for a pirate radio station. And so they were serving a lot of the Berkeley and Oakland area, and providing a lot of, Stephen Dunifer in particular started providing a lot of resources and information to other people to help them start their own micro broadcasting movements and their own pirate radio stations. Then more policy. So what the FCC is going on. So a lot of things started changing in the 80s and 90s. There was this big push in the 80s with under, what's his name? No, Reagan next, but then who's right before Reagan? Was it Carter? Anybody shout out if you know the answer to
Yeah,
that.
shout out.
Carter next. Okay, great. Yeah, so first under Carter and then under Reagan, mostly under Reagan. There were these two guys in the FCC that were appointed by both of them. One was Charles Ferris under Carter, and then Mark S. Fowler was under Reagan. And they were both of the main people deciding legislation in the FCC during the 80s. And they started just rolling back the regulations of the radio, all the things like the Fairness Doctrine and all of that were trying to put in systems that would make radio more accountable to community. They were in this big kick of that happened in the 80s of the free market, letting the free market take control. They said that public interest would determine what was in the public's interest. And so they said if people didn't like what was on the radio, they would just change the channel and they would listen to a different station. And so the free market would decide. And they said all these regulations were burdensome and unnecessary, and the program should just respond to market forces. They thought that broadcasters could better determine what the public and community wanted instead of needing to constantly have conversations with community and bring community members in. They also decided that there was no more limit to the amount of commercials that could be on a radio station. There used to be a pretty strict limit before then. But again, they said if there's too many commercials, they will just change the channel. So it won't matter, and that will make the decision for them. They never considered that everybody might make a lot of commercials. And then they also decided to do a lot less oversight of stations in general. They used to have these very, very detailed programming logs where people had to talk about literally every single program that happened on the radio and would use those for inspections of the stations. They did away with that. They said you don't have to do detailed programming logs anymore. You can just do like a write-up of 10 programs of a year and send it our way, and we'll see if it's good. And then in 1987, they fully repealed the Fairness Doctrine. They were rolling this stuff back slowly, and then by then they were just like, let's get it out of here, cut it, we don't need it. They made a move that was basically like, in order to be accountable to the community, community members can petition if they think that the radio station is not being representative of community views or is not playing the things that they like to hear. But there have been many, many petitions issued by community members over time, and most of them are just outright denied by the FCC, and they have never, ever resulted in somebody getting their license revoked from a station or even changing the way a station broadcasts. So it's sort of empty words there. Hopping back in to Free Radio Berkeley in 1993, a bit of a positive here was that kind of a totally unprecedented move when Free Radio Berkeley was really rolling and starting to become a thing. The FCC came in and tried to shut it down. And in a totally unprecedented move, this federal district court judge, Claudia Wilkin, denied the FCC's injunction to shut down Radio Free Berkeley, saying that there were some free speech issues that she didn't feel like was a good reason to shut them down. And they delayed the case. Basically, the FCC did not give up because they never give up, but they did postpone the injunction for a long time, and it really emboldened a lot of micro broadcasters all over the place because they thought, cool, we're going to be protected by free speech too. So a lot of people started doing this micro broadcasting. Eventually in 1988, the injunction did go through and they got shut down, but they had a good run there. And then in 1996, the Telecommunications Act under Clinton was another deregulation that rolled back a lot of regulations on how people gained licenses for radio broadcasting, and also sort of in the name of the free market, they were like, we're going to try and make this easier so that a lot of people can have licenses. But in fact, what it did was make it very easy for large corporations to gain monopolies on the airwaves and across different media sources as well. Oh, right. Liberate the airwaves. So we're just going to touch on a few other really rad movements that were happening around this time. That there were so many going on. One was KPBJ, which was a low power station in San Francisco, started in 1995 by Sue Carpenter. And she was maybe like the first well-known woman in the US to start her own radio station, pirate radio station. And it was all music. It was 24/7. It was just out of her apartment. And she wrote a really cool book on it called 40 Watts from Nowhere, where you can read more about it. But she worked with Stephen Dunifer of Free Radio Berkeley to start up this station. Another really cool station was Steal This Radio in the Lower East Side in New York City, which also started in 1995. Again, we can kind of see how in the wake of the Free Radio Berkeley ruling, a lot of people started doing this work. And Steal This Radio was a really cool station, broadcasting on 88.7. It was located in like a squatter community in the Lower East Side, and they would move around to try and keep the FCC off their tails. They were broadcasting at 12 watts, which is a little more normal for a pirate radio station, unlike Dunifer's 50 watts. And their programming included live music, recorded music, radio dramas, news, cultural programming. A lot of its content was like featuring people directly in their community and doing human interest stories, information about nonprofits and services, the weather, event listings, etc. They would broadcast for 6 hours on Friday night starting at 8 p.m. And one of the organizers said the broadcast often took the form of a party. Super fun. Because pirate radio is just a good time. Then there was some really cool efforts of pirate radio in Mexico during the Zapatista resistance efforts. In the 90s, there was this radio called Radio Insurgente. In 2003, it became a sort of consistent staple of spreading information and news, talking about ideas of the Zapatista movement and retelling some of their struggles. And they would transmit the programs in Spanish and also in a variety of indigenous languages. And we have a really cool on our, in the links that I sent out, there's a few cool things you could check out. One is there's a link to 2 different timelines that are interactive timelines that we put on our Sound Museum Collective website. And a lot of the things I'm talking about here, you can kind of spot them and follow along with them on the timeline. And there's also a section on our website where we have interviews with different local community members we did who were involved in pirate radio movements. And one interview is with this person, Anna Martina, who is a local West Philly radio person and was involved in a lot of these Zapatista movements, helping people build pirate radio in Mexico. So that is a super cool thing to check out if you have the time. Continued resistance. So in 1998, Seizing the Airwaves, which was a book that was co-written by Stephen Dunifer, I forget the other guy's name, but it's linked also in the links that I sent out. It's a totally free book. The entire PDF is online and it's linked in that document. It talks about the history of pirate radio and a lot of history of really rad movements using radio. And then the final section of the book has a comprehensive technical guide and how-to manual for how to go on the air. And it's complete with schematics and sound advice. So that was just like 1998. In response to that case, shutting them down was kind of just like, we're sharing all the information completely with the public, so anybody can do this. Then Radio Mutiny was a pirate radio station in West Philadelphia that started in 1996. They had 50 volunteers. They were broadcasting 6 days of the week. And they were a really like just very local, very rad group of people who were broadcasting all sorts of content, from sex positive content to live actions and protests. And they had some head-to-head standoffs with the FCC where they shut them down and then they reopened, and then the FCC did officially shut them down in 1998. But in that time, at the end of their broadcasting, they held this thing called the Micro Broadcasting Conference in Philadelphia, where they gathered everybody who heard about it and could come, who was into pirate radio, or doing their own micro broadcasting or wanted to get into it. And they gathered all these people together and just had a bunch of conferences where people could connect, talk about what they were doing, and share information and share technology, and literally teach each other how to broadcast and how to make their broadcasts better, and how to evade the FCC. And yeah, it was a really, really cool event. And we were lucky enough to talk to a bunch of people who were involved in Radio Mutiny. And we have a lot of resources on our website of their old broadcasts and information that was disseminated at the Micro Broadcasting Conference. So that's a cool thing to check out too. And then the Radio Mutiny folks, some of them sort of, when they had to shut down the station, they then created this thing called Prometheus Radio, which is still happening today. Yeah, very cool. It's a nonprofit organization, and they build, support, and advocate for community radio stations that bring together and empower local participatory voices and movements for social change. And I'll talk about some of the stuff they've done in this next slide. First, getting into one of the more recent FCC moves to try and restrict low power stations happened in 2000, where it was called the Broadcasting Preservation Act, which is a really ironic name because it was preserving broadcasting for big corporation stations, and basically made much stricter rules about how low power stations could broadcast, because it was claiming, back to what you was talking about with interference, that these low power stations were causing way too much interference with some of these bigger stations that had more expensive and official licenses. So they shut down a lot of low power stations, and they made it much harder for low power stations to even exist or get licenses. But luckily, Prometheus Radio and other radio activists sort of immediately started working to change this law as soon as it happened. And it took them 10 years, but eventually in 2010, they got the Local Community Radio Act passed, which basically rolled back a lot of what happened in the Broadcasting Preservation Act. And it mandated the FCC to issue brand new non-commercial FM radio licenses all across the country to nonprofits and their partnering community groups, including for the first time in major cities, because a lot of the time it was easier to get a low power license if you were not around anywhere where you would interfere with bigger stations. But this was targeting everywhere, including major cities, expanding low power stations' rights to exist. And there's a little just shot down here of Low Power to the People, which is another really cool book about a lot of this stuff that I'm touching on, by Christina Dunbar Hester. If you want to check it out. And I think that's all I have for this section, but I guess we will check out and see if there's questions. Do you two have anything to add before we jump into that?
Yeah, I think that. Oh,
Go ahead.
you want to rock paper scissors?
No.
I guess one thing I was going to add is like, and I think this is like a cool segue into the next section that Gladys is going to do too, is like noting that like a lot of the ways in which low power stations were also working all across the country and around the world, like for instance, a lot of unions were using like low power stations to unionize a lot of workers. And in that vein too, like historically, especially in the US, a lot of like immigrants have used low power stations to just like communicate in their language, like their worker rights, which is huge. Another, I think, example is a lot of indigenous communities have used radio on reservations too, and a lot of Black communities also. So like there's a lot of different ways in which like low power has been so important to like very hyper local communities as far as like disseminating information, and like really want to touch upon that. And then also I think a big one too, which I don't want to go too much into now, but the ways in which radio was like a pivotal point in like the Haitian Revolution is really sick, and something I recommend looking into a little bit more if you're interested.
Yeah, I did want to add that there is something, that a proposal that went through with the FCC in 2020. It didn't go through, but it was proposed. It was called the Simple 250, where low power FM radio stations could upgrade from 100 watts to 250, and this would particularly benefit rural areas that don't necessarily have access to the sort of range that 100-watt radio stations would, and then the station could offer even airtime to those. So the FCC denied that proposal because it's too complex. And I think that now going into this next portion of really like, how do we protect the airwaves?
Oh, should we take a break first?
Oh yeah, are there any questions?
I think like, wait, another thing I wanted to say to you just before we move on from policy as well, just to like really emphasize right now when we're talking about the monopolization of the airwaves, when you apply for a radio license, if you receive that license, you have it until you're dead. There's like no like timeout or anything like that, which means that like a lot of these corporations that can't die have these licenses and are holding onto these licenses. And then when a license becomes available, which once again, when we're talking about like the broadband, right, we have 88 to 108 megahertz. That's a limited frequency set, right? There is not that many stations in between. And also you can't even use every single number on that dial because of interference policies. So when a license becomes available, you have thousands upon thousands of people applying for this one license in a specific area. And a lot of times what ends up happening is like your application and whether or not you end up getting this license is determined by how much money you have. Like, what is your ability to maintain equipment? What does your equipment look like? Who's on staff? What kind of board? Do you have a board? What kind of board do you have? And that's a lot of times too, like when we think about college radio, a lot of times like colleges get to like scoop up these licenses because they have access to that equipment. I just wanted to say that when we were talking about.
Well, also pretty much all of the radio frequencies available, specifically in like major cities, but in a lot of areas are taken. And like Eve was saying, they don't really expire, and the FCC has never denied somebody's request for a renewal of a license. They've never denied it. So pretty much once you have it, it's yours, and that's just like maintain sort of the power in the same hands for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah, which, yeah, that is a good point. Like you do have to apply, I think it's like every 4 or every 7 years or something to get your license renewed. But yeah, once again, those applications like usually are not denied.
Never.
Are there any questions?
No, I didn't see any questions.
Okay, I'm gonna just quickly go through this and then we'll have some dialogue all together, reimagining like what radio could be, whether in policy or not. So we already touched upon make applications for a license much more accessible. So corporations are buying out low power FMs. That's also something that we should stop, they also buy up these translator signal repeaters. So you could hear a station here that, let's say it's a, you know, they have 250 watts. You can hear that same station in New York as well as here. And to be able to hear it that distance, you need a repeater signal. So this signal will go off into a different location, different antenna, and send it off. And that way it is eating up an airway, the airwave, so that someone in that local area or town would be able to have a station with the 3 to 10 mile radius of a regular 100-watt low power station, but then they can't because that repeater is taken by one of these full power like corporation stations. A lot of these low power stations are also rely on volunteers and underwriting. Underwriting is getting funds from different businesses in the community, organizations, to be able to broadcast public service announcements for them. And then that is money that funds any sort of gear that you might need for the station, any sort of equipment that might be needed. So I think that's really important. Something else that's the Prometheus Radio is also working on is refining and reforming the spectrum. So there are different bands that TV uses, for example, like channels 2 through 6 are not used, and those can be converted to be used for FM radio. So right now we're going from 88 to 108, but that could be opened up to 57.9. So then you have all of these from 57 to 88 that could be allocated to community radio stations. And then I won't get into the internet, but what about the internet? You know, it's ones and zeros. It's more database through cable rather than using what we have, but we're probably going to be seeing a lot of regulation within that sphere as well. So with these sort of ways to protect the airwaves and thinking about what we know, the policy already, how else it's been used, I think a really great, for me, it was very influential, was a documentary that's also a fiction. It's like documentary style fiction movie called Born in Flames by Lizzie Borden. And they use this pirate radio as a way to talk about racism, classism. It's really, really amazing. And here's a list of some of the great community stations in Philadelphia. So now we kind of want to imagine and open it up. We don't have much time left. I don't think we need to break out into groups. What do you think? But what are things that have come up for you in terms of using radio in the future to amplify voices? What kind of things should be broadcasted? What's really important?
Yeah, I think like a great starting off point is imagine that radio could be anything you wanted. What would you want to hear on the radio? What would you like to be able, like imagine if a radio was like a library. You know, like what sort of things would you like to, what sort of information, what sort of music, what would you want to hear on the radio that you aren't receiving right now? Horoscopes.
We did get a question here. It says, how do you all think about public radio stations fitting into all of this?
Well, okay, I have a personal opinion about this as somebody who works at Scribe, which is that, so the West Philadelphia, the WPD 88.1, which is the West Philadelphia Community Station, has a very short distance right now because what Gladys was saying about signal repeaters, NPR actually has a signal repeater, WHYY specifically in Jersey, that actually makes it so you can barely hear 88.1 right outside of West Philadelphia. Also, NPR, you know, has good content, but they've fought back a lot against a lot of these resistance movements that Jackie was talking about because they were like, well, we can just do it better. So we actually don't think that you should give more power to like low power stations because we as NPR can do it better. So I do think that they have quality content, but I wish that, I mean, like when you think about, this is all personal opinions too, because you asked, but like when you think about NPR, you think of a very specific person who listens to NPR. Like I think that NPR is a very specific demographic, and I would just be more interested in NPR like allocating their resources or just like their airtime. But yeah, once again, personal opinions about it is that like WPB has a really short range at the moment because of the signal repeater that WHYY has in Jersey.
I think public radio stations should offer and allocate time to community efforts. So for example, the community station that is in North Philly, the WJYN Uptown Radio shares its station and has 10 hours allocated to the, I'm sorry, it's G-Town Radio has allocated to the Germantown Life Enrichment Center and the Germantown United Community Development Corporation, CDC. So they share time, it's 10 hours each, or it's something like 10 or 7 hours. And I would like to see that happen a lot more in public radio.
Right. And you know, that's also a result of the fact that like these licenses are so scarce that you have like these low power stations sharing their licenses with other groups, because when will somebody get the opportunity to even apply for a license?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, I don't think like public radio is the greatest evil of the radio corporations. But yeah, it's unfortunate that, right, it's kind of the only or one of the very, very few radio stations that are committed to any community driven content or any content that is supposed to reflect news and the world and things going on, versus the like very, very large commercial conglomerates. So it's kind of like pitting, yeah, it's kind of like pushing everybody into a corner to fight against each other, when I really do think that like the huge commercial conglomerates are the biggest problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? You can come off of mute and turn your video on if you'd like.
Yeah, you please jump in.
Jump in, or else we'll go into breakout rooms. I guess like just to like start to get some ideas rolling. Also, anyone please cut me off at any point if you have something that you want to say. I'm thinking about like when we did interviews with like some of the broadcasters from Radio Mutiny, which, as Jackie said, was the pirate station that existed in West Philadelphia. You know, some examples of like alternative radio programming they did. This one really stuck out to me because I don't know, I was like, that's sick, is the Trash Report, which this one DJ, like he would like bike around and essentially was like broadcasting what, you know, Craigslist free is today, where people would be, he would like go on the radio and be like, okay, so on the corner of 49th and Chestnut, I saw this couch, it looks like this, it's trash day, better go pick it up. And would just like do reports on like the cool stuff that he would find around West Philadelphia and like around the city that people could go pick up. And I think that's like an interesting idea of like hyper local content and like a way we could be utilizing the radio.
What did somebody say in the chat?
Yeah, it was really great. I wanted to read that too. Someone said, as other states shut down access to information for queer kids in schools and libraries, programming for queer kids where tuning in is totally anonymous could be so crucial.
Yo, yes, and that actually is reminding me that one of our later workshops, we're going to talk a lot about queer radio history, and there were some programs like that existed. That's very cool.
And I wanted to show you here, I hope that you can see it, our Bandcamp, where we've actually archived, it's on our website as well, the bigger research that we did towards the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021. We archived Radio Mutiny programs. So there are just more of the music programs, but there's also Incarceration Nation they had on there, Queer Girl Hour, And you can go on here. The condom lady was really, really awesome and talked a lot about healthcare, AIDS, HIV, a lot of different important issues at the time. There's some Steal This Radio archive that was also broadcast here from New York. And then we have some of the other more coverage, like of demonstrations and actions. So you have here the HCV conference. It is the 90s, so there's a little language. I would say it's not with the times. Yeah, but Nationals People Campaign, News Hour, the rally that took place in 2002, things like that you can find, or you can also go to our website.
Yeah, and also the interviews are on here that I mentioned
With Anna Martina.
I do
that's on
want
their
to
brain.
respond to what Kate said in the chat, because when we do get into like like the queer programming that we did a lot of research on not this most recent fall, but the fall before, a huge thing was like radio was used more in like queer communities as a way, because during a time when you could literally be arrested for being gay, and people are still being killed for being gay, unfortunately, but the radio was a huge tool in like uniting these communities, and that you could call in and get advice. If you were a teenager and you like had nowhere else to go and you didn't know any other gay people and you just like needed advice. There was also a really cool thing, I believe in New York City, called Out FM, where people could call to like come out of the closet on air. And you can find a bunch of that too within our Emotion of Real Time archive. I know it was really incredible. I think like another thing I wanted to bring up too, when we're talking about like just alternative forms of radio, and even Gladys, if you want to talk about this a little bit more as well, is the Philadelphia Bail Fund for a while was doing this really cool project where they were setting up a very low watt, I think it was a 7-watt transmitter down at RCF, and they were broadcasting into the correctional facilities, so loved ones could speak with so loved ones could just speak with people who are on the inside, because one of the like few forms of connection that they have is the radio. So that was something that was happening for a while. And I feel like you have a good story.
There's a beautiful story on how someone was recommended a $300 transmitter, and right here at the Roundhouse, they have people incarcerated in there that can see outward and have radio. And so what they did was buy this $300 transmitter and able to speak directly to their loved one from right outside, seeing them. And again, it's a one-way, but it's so powerful, especially when there's so much police corruption.
Yeah, I wonder if we should like just have a couple minutes of quiet so people can think, and then if anybody like has any ideas about future imaginings of radio, you can just like unmute and jump in at any moment. But I would love to give people, like, we've been talking for so long, so I'd love to give people like a second to absorb and think.
Maybe you want to go back to that prompt slide. Yeah. Also back in break. Yeah.
I'm wondering, while folks are sort of thinking through these questions, if we can talk about the upcoming in-person workshops and what might take place, which start actually next Monday, and there's still a few spots available. So yeah, could you guys talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, our next workshop will be 2 weeks from now. I believe it's the 18th of April.
Sorry, yes.
And it's the first of 3 where we're going to start with just taking apart some radios, seeing what the components are, seeing how those work, and it will also be a collaboration on an installation we're doing at Asian Arts Initiative in June, where there will be a radio art installation using our body as the antenna. So all the electromagnetic waves within us and how interference works, especially given the urban architecture, the urban landscape, and building that into. So you'll be able to walk through and interact with these. And so that will be really fun, hands-on first workshop. And the second one.
Well, I was just gonna add that, yeah, you'll like physically be popping open these radios, and we'll also be doing some circuit bending. So we'll be like messing around with the tech that's inside of them as we're learning about what's in there, and also just like making it make weird sounds. So that one's gonna be really, really fun and very interactive. Yeah, then the third one, is that the one about
the second and third will be more about radio content. And so the first one is recording, and the third one is editing and getting it radio ready. So,
well, but one of those is about, I guess the first one, so the third workshop, 2 weeks after our second workshop, is about, we'll be talking about radio programming and like how to put together a cool program and sort of how to find content, how to interview people, and we'll be referencing a lot of the queer radio history that we're mentioning. And so we'll be sort of looking at some of that, going through a little bit of that history and using some of those things as examples for really cool radio programming. Then in the last workshop is where we'll get really into the details of like, how do you physically put that together through your tech on your computer. And that one will be more hands-on, where we'll be ideally having people use content that they were able to create in those 2 weeks and putting it together into some sort of show, which maybe would even be used for radio AAI, which might be a thing coming up in a few months. Who knows? Yeah.
That sounds amazing. Love it.
and thank you for derritiendo el hielo, the melting the ice information. We always want to know, soundmuseumcollective@gmail.com if you have any information. We want to know everything about radio and how to get people's voices that need to be amplified.
Yeah, if anybody has thoughts on any of these questions or just wants to talk about anything that we touched on tonight, please jump in.
Well, I'm just going to jump in and say that there's just so much amazing information. I feel like I'm going to go back and watch the recording again. There's just so much to process. I love it. And I think maybe that's what's happening, is a lot of processing. But I'm really excited to see what happens in the hands-on workshops. And I feel like these conversations will continue to happen in person as you guys are working on actually hands-on radio experimenting. So I'm really excited to see what's up next.
Something I'd be curious about is if anybody in the chat has experience being on the radio and what that experience is like for you, if anyone has like any dreams of like being on the radio, or anything, or anything.
Well, I saw Daphne was unmuting themselves. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Daphne. I was just thinking about for maybe what radio could be in the future. I know that living in Philly and getting to be go to smaller music venues and house shows and kind of get involved in a local scene has been really rewarding. And I wonder if radio could kind of be a bigger tool for that, to kind of connect people. I feel like they're social media is great, but I feel like having something that is just a platform that everyone can tune into together would be really cool in the future, maybe.
Kind of like what you were saying.
Mobile radio.
Well, I forget which station you're talking about. That was like, it would turn into a party. Totally, that was Skillet Radio. Would turn into a party. Yeah. Or just like have a better idea of like what shows are even happening. Party chat, but on radio. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's rad. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. We hope to get a feedback form out to you to make this much more accessible to others in the future. Anything that might help us.
You can, if you want to type into the chat, Kate, you totally can, and we'll read it out. Nice. Yeah. Okay, policy-wise, is thinking it'd be cool to decriminalize LPFM broadcasting and shift from FCC regulation to community norms.
Yeah.
Yes, totally. I know it's really cool. I mean, it's so interesting. I feel like to think about how much the FCC, especially, I am always like freaked out by the shifts from the 80s, but how much they've shaped what radio is today and how different it would be if we just, if it was regulated differently and if the norm was different.
Also, it's like worth noting too that like in 2021 under the Trump administration, the Piracy Act was updated where it's like the minimum fine now for being caught as a radio pirate is $2 million.
And they also like asked for a ton of funding to seek and destroy pirate radio stations, which they didn't get, but.
And the good thing is that they don't have that much funding. So the only way they can also do that is by a complaint system on their website. So they really won't triangulate people or anything unless someone complains, which is usually when you're on someone else's frequency. If you were to hop on one that's in between somewhere, but they don't have as much funding as they used to have.
Yeah, I think like specifically like transportation frequencies. So like if you were broadcasting illegally, like you really would want to make sure that you weren't interfering with like airport communications, because that's like a huge way to get caught.
Oh, we have a great question in here also about thoughts on podcasting and how it's similar or different to radio. And I feel like for me, one thing that comes up so much, and like one of the reasons why we got so into the tech of the radio in this talk, is because I think that is the big distinguishing feature between online and podcast information and radio, is literally the ways and the possibilities of regulation. It's interesting because even though the FCC tries so hard to shut down pirate radio stations and consistently has, they keep happening because anybody with the technology can broadcast. And so in that way, to me, it feels like there's more possibility sometimes than the radio or the internet, which feels much more out of my hands personally of what goes on there and what is taken off. I feel like there's a lot more really smart internet people who can censor a lot of stuff on the internet pretty easily. And we see that happen all the time with like the big internet conglomerations of Instagram and Facebook and Google and all of that. And just the fact that the tech of radio is relatively simple makes it feel really accessible and and resistance focused in a way that is harder to do, I think, with the internet.
Yeah, I think with that too, there is this, and I think you sort of started to touch upon this idea where like, yeah, podcasts are cool, but like due to like algorithms, which by the way, the algorithms exist because you have these conglomerates who are trying to like garner your attention so they can make money, right? I go to listen to a podcast and dang, if somebody hasn't recommended a podcast to me previously, I have no idea what podcast to listen to. There is so many podcasts out there. How do you even begin to start like sorting versus like if you have like a very local low power station, you know, I think
You flip through all the stations within like a couple minutes.
right, exactly.
Yeah,
And I think that like also within the algorithm too, like my Spotify knows my algorithm and it's like really hard for me to break out of that algorithm. And I kind of hate it for that reason. Like I'm trying to get like all different kinds of info all the time. And like honestly, like I feel so limited sometimes because of algorithms in that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think podcasts are awesome in that they are more open to everyone. Like, you know, you don't have to do something illegal to get your voice on the internet, but it just feels like something that could be taken away, I guess, is kind of how I feel about it more easily.
Yeah, all of these are such great content information because you know what I like to hear more on the phone is like how to defend yourself legally from an illegal landlord or you know any sort of information. Filatinos actually has in South Philly, they do have a kids show. It's really cool. And then on WPB there was a show called Indie Radio Garden, and then on there it was called Jubilee Voices, and it was kids
It's still on.
believe in Germantown. Yeah, it's still.
Oh no,
Where
the
they interview.
Jubilee Voices is in West Philly. It's
Oh,
the
Jubilee's
school
in
on
what?
42nd and Chester.
Yeah, I love these things that people are saying too. Yeah, hot girl music, old hags in discussion, recipes, cooking shows, serial fiction, shows programmed by children. Totally. Yeah, like they were just saying, there are some great stations doing that, but I totally agree. It's like a lot of kids' voices are not widely represented on media, and kids are so smart. Skillshares on air is awesome. I want Skillshares on air.
Yeah, and I think there's also this thing about like reinventing radio that I'm interested in too. Like call-in options for the radio are huge, right? Because then like you're kind of like breaking down this barrier between like someone who's just like performing and there's like just more of an engagement between listener and broadcaster that I'm really interested in like finding more ways in which that can be possible. And I think that's something that happens like a lot with like ham radio or like people who have access to like two-way radios. It would just be interesting to see that like on a bigger scale, I think.
Yeah. Anonymous Colin should have talked trash on your crummy landlords and bad employers, which is, I mean, yeah, it's so cool, like a show to spread information about who is doing wrong to the community too is like so important. I agree with the algorithm struggle, podcast. Yeah, Spotify is not promoting feels community-based as radio. Yeah, the localness, the fact that radio is literally like in space, is centered in a space, does make it also very unique in that way.
I have a survey question. I'm gonna assume, well, I don't want to assume anything actually. We are all in this radio thing. I'm wondering, a lot of feedback I get about radios recently is that people don't have radios. And I'm wondering, maybe if you even want to like raise your hand if you have like an accessible radio to you. I'm mostly for data collection. I'm just wondering. And a car radio counts, but I am thinking of like house radios. Okay, Kate has one. I know Nico has one. Josephine has one. Interesting. Marie has one. Jenny has one. How many of you use like your phone or like your internet on your phone, like a radio app on your phone versus like having like a radio in your house?
That's just wondering.
Oh, radio.garden is amazing.
Mhm.
You can listen to any radio all over the world. If you are not familiar with it, radio.garden, yeah, you can listen to in Turkey or Sweden and just click on it and listen. Thank you for bringing that up.
Wow. I loved hearing what everyone wants on the radio. Let's get corporations off the airwaves. Let's get them off.
I hope you join us in the next workshops that are coming up. We'd love to have you. And thank you, AAI, Pleisher.
We're gonna try and make an effort to get radios to people, so hit us up if you want one. We'll try and make it happen. Yeah, definitely. Hit us up with more radio ideas. Yeah, anytime. Yeah, we hope to see you at the next workshops. It'll be really fun. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Anything else to say?
No, please fill out the feedback form so we can get better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
That was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
That was so great. Oh my God. Okay, wait, hold on. I'm gonna stop.
I would